So I had a conversation with several friends about synthetic a priori judgments, and I wanted to kind of delve into that a little bit and make it into a video. And basically, what I'm going to title this video is Are Synthetic a priori judgments possible? And I think the way to conceptualize and understand this question is to also be familiar with the history of sort of philosophy up to that point. And this is a question that Kant picks up. So Kant's central question in the critique of pure judgment is: are synthetic a priori judgments possible? In order to answer that, we need to understand what are synthetic a priori judgments, how are they different from other judgments. Need to go through some definitional terms, take a step back, also see where Kant is kind of responding, and then kind of go from there. So there's basically four categories that are very important, and they kind of are in two subsets. One is a priori and a posteriori. I'll define those shortly. And another is analytical judgments and synthetic judgments. Now, for each of those, you can match them up with another. So you can have a priori analytical judgments, and you can have a posteriori analytical judgments. You can also have a posteriori synthetic judgments and a priori synthetic judgments. Now, the one that we want to focus on ultimately is going to be: are a priori synthetic judgments possible? Let me break this down to you in simple terms. So a priori is basically like the domain of mathematics. We're just saying, as a matter of definition, like a priori, you need to accept this to be on the same level playing field, so we agree on this term. Like, you, in the sense that you need to understand Kant, what he's talking about. It's like 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay, that's an a priori judgment. It's just in our heads. Now, we can go into that a little bit in more depth, but I'm just keeping it surface level for right now. And then you have a posteriori, which is like, oh, it's raining outside. That's like a basis of a definition of like, or not a definition, observational question. So the once we've gone through the categories of a priori and a posteriori, then it's time to go to synthetic and analytical. Analytical is a little bit easier in my opinion, because it's basically definitional. It's an exploratory thing within the domain of a definition. So like, all bachelors are unmarried is a analytical judgment in Kantian terms, right? So like, if you're accepting what it means to be an analytical judgment in Kantian terms, it basically means something that is just like that's what it is. So it's inherent within the definition of analytical terms. Synthetic is more interesting in my opinion, because all bodies drop. That's not inherent within the definition of synthetic. So that's kind of, I mean, that's interesting to have. Another one. So let's combine them now, and specifically let's combine a priori synthetic. So basically, you're within the realm of questioning something. This is the basis of science, right? Everything has causation, or causation exists, isn't inherent within a priori or a posteriori or analytical or synthetic judgments. So you can think about it in that way as well. And so it's an interesting payoff when you think about it in that way. The cat is on the mat is a synthetic judgment. 7 plus 5 is 12 is an a priori judgment, and then a posteriori is like the sky is cloudy type of thing. These are just examples. Now, are analytic judgments possible? Yes, but trivially so, I would argue, and so would Kant, because it's basically saying it's all a priori, everything is inherent within the definition, and therefore you're just clarifying something rather than finding some new knowledge. Now, the key question that Kant wants to expand on is like a synthetic a priori. So that is like, every event has a cause. But how do you know every event has a cause? It's not necessarily analytical, because an event, the definition of an event does not imply a cause. And it's not empirical either. We're not observing the world out there to understand that. So now, synthetic a priori would be talking about the ideas of freedom, immortality, God. These things aren't necessarily empirically observable. They're not necessarily deduced within our own logic. and it's important because this is what will make the categorization of sciences, mathematics, natural science, and metaphysics is part of the Kantian revolution. Now, let's get deeper into the Kantian revolution. Aristotle kind of started with the idea of empiricism, and Kant kind of flips that. He says, how do the objects that we observe, that's Aristotle, right? But Kant kind of flips that to conform to our knowledge of thinking. How does the mind actively structure the world? It's not just passively observing everything. And he says that we have forms of intuition. Now, this is more of a technical term. It's not necessarily like intuition that might be used in common parlance. And so what he means specifically here is that our mind, we have two forms of intuition that our mind has. It's space and time. Space is from the outer senses, so that's a posteriori, and then we have time, which is sort of an inner sense. And then geometry is kind of the shortest distance between two points in a straight line. That's sort of a synthetic a priori truth, grounded in the structure of intuition and space. And then arithmetic depends on the form of time, which is like the succession of addition and counting. And that's an a priori truth as well. So you have these categories of understanding. It's unity, causality, necessity. Those aren't derived from experience from a Kantian perspective. Those are rules that makes experience possible. So an example is causality, like this notion of causation, right, is something not that we see, but it's something that our mind uses to organize the phenomena in the world that we observe. So event has a cause is a synthetic a priori judgment made possible by that category in our mind of causality. So the technical revolution that Kant has is that our judgments are made possible because of this manifold intuition that we have spread out on raw sense data, and it's synthesized by the categories into unified experiences of objects, like we just talked about. You have unity, causality, substance, necessity, and then you have this thing called the transcendental unity of appreciation. The I think is what's able to accompany all the representations in the mind. So the mind supplies the universal that takes in the raw sense data into our mind and structures all this. So the payoff, again, is mathematics is space and time. Natural science is causation, substance. Metaphysics is the tricky one because it can't legitimately, within this context that Kant is talking about, extend synthetic a priori claims beyond possible experience. So, in short, like a priori judgments are possible. And that is a fascinating idea, and it's worthy of consideration, and it's worth exploring other things out there in the world to see how thinkers, like how did Hume influence Kant, how did Descartes and Bacon in the empirical tradition influence Hume, and what was he responding to, and Berkeley, and we can work our way back to Aquinas, and maybe even take a poetic side turn to Dante, and then we can go back to Plato and Aristotle, and maybe even see how Plato is, spinning off from the pre-Socratics. And then once we've done that, it'd be worthwhile to take a step further from Kant. How does Hegel respond to Kant? And then how do we get into modernity of philosophy from there?